Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lifetime Show. So, today joining with in the show is Dr. Stephanie Kruzmark. She's the Vice President of Enrollment Management for the ILIF School of Theology in Denver, Colorado, US. And the topic today that we are going to discuss is how crisis can become the greatest lesson for higher education and why the model needs to change. Welcome on the show.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure.
First of all, I want to ask that why education? So, why did you choose to become an educator? And as you have been working in the field of higher education for the last 18 years, and how has been your experience so far?
Yes, thank you for the question. I chose education. It really it's a calling, to be quite honest. I noticed in my kind of primary and secondary education as a self-identified African American woman that there were a lack of, if you will, brown and black faces, lack of women that reflected my identity. And so I felt the calling and the need to help really reframe, reshape, and think about higher education in a way that could fully be inclusive of those kind of underserved, underrepresented, and under-resourced populations. And that's been my dedication and commitment for the last 18 years. And I see that certainly in my US framework, but I also see that as a global challenge as well.
So, have you seen a change or a shift with education becoming more diverse and more inclusive in the last 18 years? Has it been has there been progress, or has it been a letdown in your opinion or in your experience?
That's a great question as well. I have seen increases in motivation and persistence by the historically excluded, underserved, and underrepresented populations, but I've seen them continue to hit the same roadblocks or the same challenges in terms of access and equity that often plays out through their ability to financially afford higher education, as well as to kind of balance the multiple roles that they play in their life, whether that be, as a spouse, as an auntie or an uncle, as a partner, in balancing the need to often work while going to school in order to afford that experience. On that note, I believe that especially the U.S. higher education model, and I would argue that the global model that tends to be based on a Eurocentric model envisions that students are able, or people that want to pursue higher education are able to stop their immediate lives and focus 100% as being a student. And we know now today the greater forces of the environment, of one's health, of one's community, has an immediate impact on that notion or that model that we can take a pause out of our normal lives and just focus on the intellectual studies.
So in Pakistan, we have some other forms of exclusion. So it's a very class-based society, and normally there is this concept of elite schools, and a lot of people who cannot cross that financial barrier and can be part of those institutions that provide good education, but they're elite in a very economic sense. So I would like to know what have been the tools that you have seen that has enabled you, since you're working in a leadership position, to add more inclusion and more diversity to educational institutions.
Sure. The first and foremost is access to entry. In terms of financial barriers, it's really holding institutions to their professed values and missions in terms of being wanting to become places of diversity and inclusion, and putting some, we say in the US, a football term, I apologize, but putting some skin in the game. So in terms of institutional support through scholarships, or a willingness to look at some of the revenue models that adjust or would allow discounts, say, to tuition or fees, and really going through an annual process, a budgeting process, to determine if the operational expenses are actually directed more towards student success versus some extravagant expenses, such as maybe building investments, plant improvements, really making sure that if we are truly about student success, that all of our revenue models, access models, curricular models for that matter, ensure that the student's experience is centered first and foremost. And that can be challenging work, especially getting folks to think outside of a normal framework. You mentioned this notion of elite institutions. I will also say that while I value and appreciate many of my colleagues and friends that have graduated from some of the Harvards and Yales and Stanfords of the world, I have a little disappointment or unrest when we continue to look at those schools for taking the lead. In this case, with the global pandemic, the fact that Harvard is still thinking about opening its doors, this fall. About 60%, I think, of U.S. Institutions are thinking about an on-campus experience in the midst of so much uncertainty. So I think we need to rethink and keep challenging one another to make sure that we're supporting our students' health, safety, and success.
So Abdul Basir Khan is saying if he can ask a general question. Basir, go ahead, please. Whatever your question are, we'll try to answer. I am getting another question that is kind of related to the law degrees that we offer. So Raja Dil, I would advise you to send us an inbox message and then we'll answer your question. But you do enroll with Lincoln's Inn when you are becoming a barrister and studying with us. That's a very short answer. So coming back to the topic, in Pakistan, there are not financial tools available to the general public as there are in the US, that a lot of students who do have good credit can enroll and cross that financial barrier and become part of institution. They'll still have challenges. Getting into a good college or a university would still be a challenge. But does those financial tools, do they help? Have you seen in terms of adding more diversity and more inclusion in the classrooms?
Certainly, the U.S. had a trend most recently in the 1970s when we started instituting what we call land grant institutions, where there was federal public funding available to colleges and universities to support the enrollment of more diverse students. We have the GI Bill, which supports students that have served in the military or are actively serving in the military to make higher education accessible. In terms of specific support for diversity and inclusion, that is yet to come. Students certainly do, as you mentioned, students that are quote unquote U.S. citizens or green card holders and have good credit are able to access federal financial aid that provides loans and grants. And certainly that is a way to build access. On the flip side, there is a continuing debate of whether or not that is actually setting students up for success after graduation, because often they graduate with impending debt, and some debt that they technically probably won't pay off in their lifetime, or depending on the field of work that they choose, may cause some difficulty in terms of just balancing their day-to-day lives and budget. But
so before I get into the challenges we are facing because of COVID in higher education, I want to ask what kind of challenges do you see in terms of student learning even before the pandemic, that the traditional model that we had? What kind of challenges were very visible and very out there?
Sure. There are many, but a couple immediate challenges are the notion of serving students both as what we call traditional and non-traditional learners. So for that student that's just graduating from high school, the theory is that student will then transition from their mother or father's home, their family's home, and then have a residential experience on campus. There is certainly room for that, but that population, the volume of high school graduates is actually decreasing. And in fact, in about 5 to 6 years, there's going to be an enrollment cliff. And so that notion of leaving your parents' home and moving away to college or university may or may not be a possibility, or there may actually be more volume on campuses in terms of residential halls than there are actual students. So that leads many institutions to look towards the adult learners, those that have maybe started their college education but stopped out for a reason, or those that are looking to skill up, or maybe career changers. But knowing those adult learners more than likely have families, homes, lives, and jobs, and how they balance accessing that higher education is of great importance. And so the notion of those adult learners being able to physically go to a campus to take a class creates some challenges and difficulty, and often they are what do I want to say? They face challenges in terms of balancing when classes are scheduled, where they're scheduled, in balance with their work life already. In terms of diversity and inclusion, well, there are colleges and universities that are continuing to kind of answer the call of the U.S. civil rights movement back in the 1960s. There are still challenges in terms of institutions, in terms of who they're recruiting and how they're recruiting those students. Institutions are playing a competitive game in terms of ranking, and some of those rankings, or even their accreditation for that matter, are based on how many students are successfully graduating from their institution. And by and large, there can be an implicit bias, if you will, in terms of determining if a student will be successful based on their academic background. And we know that in the US, based on our history of racism, that many students of color may not present initially in their application as a strong, potentially successful student based on GPA or quality of education. And so often from the first moment they try to enter the institution, they may be denied or given even less scholarship to be able to support their education. So those are a few challenges that are occurring right now.
So with this pandemic and with this paradigm shift in higher education, so do you see these challenges becoming more prevalent, or has the pandemic provided an opportunity for the institution and for the students as well to create a more level field? So what has been your first impressions as you're opening up, like for your fall semester?
Sure. Well, immediately at our institution right now, we're finding that we'll probably bring in a similar size class as we have last year, although we have made the decision to offer all of our classes online this fall. Traditionally, about 70% of our students were taking classes online, and so the good news is that our faculty and our curricular systems or learning systems are already set up to support online success. Whereas there are other institutions that may have been hesitant or slow to change and thinking about offering more online access to learning and instruction. And that is also impacting faculty's ability to prepare or willingness to prepare. So you've got a couple different dynamics occurring where you have faculty that are being asked to teach online classes when they've been used to maybe teaching in person in the lecture hall and building that in-person engagement with their students, now having to take that class that was originally built to be offered on campus or in person to an online format. And we know it's not just as simple as setting up a virtual classroom and offering that course. Faculty have to really think about how do they ensure that those learning objectives that may have been set for an in-person experience translate to an online environment. We're also finding, as you mentioned earlier, that some of the notions of, or I should say examples of exclusion when it comes to diversity and inclusion are becoming more pronounced, especially by a student's social economic background. For those traditional learners that may have been having an on-campus experience, living on campus, getting engaged in student activities, now being asked to return to their family's home, depending on that student's background, that student may now be trying to figure out finding some space, physical space. They need a laptop. They need high-speed access to internet. They also may need to take on an extra job or two because their mother or father may have been laid off. In fact, about 47 million Americans in the U.S. have filed unemployment, and about half of the working population in the U.S. actually is working. And so it's really hitting kind of families from lower or middle income backgrounds the hardest in terms of whether or not they should keep their students in college. Can they actually afford the tuition? And can that student, even if they are learning online, how do they balance the full-time student role as well as knowing that they may have to also try to find work to support their family? So it really is giving opportunity. I think the silver lining is creative thinking in terms of how they maintain learning, but also how we think about how we build community. Can that be done in a virtual environment as opposed to on campus? And can there be an opportunity to have some flexibility of when those courses are actually offered? Because we need to rely on, say, availability of a physical lecture hall. We can offer classes at the same time on days and give students that opportunity to engage. So there's a lot of dynamic complexity and dynamic aspects going on, not just here in the U.S., but certainly globally. And I think there's a way through technology, as we're doing today, to really continue to build that community without the lag time of time and space.
Yeah, I think we have been having similar problems. A lot of students who had to go back to their homes, and they are not living in bigger cities where there was a internet connection very readily available, or a good connection was available. Now they are in remote areas where they're facing that difficulty of coming online, and that kind of like excludes them because again, with this pandemic, it's not very safe for them to live in hostels or dorms. So that has created a challenge here in Pakistan as well. So moving forward, what do you see? Like, would there be a shift back, and will the institution go back, and the students will want the institution to go back to traditional learning, or would it be a hybrid learning model? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a U.S. Higher education publication called the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I think the last report that I saw of the 4,300 colleges and universities in the U.S., of which there aren't any, about 60% are planning to open up their campus this fall,
Okay.
business as usual, whereas about 30% are planning to do a hybrid model. Some are thinking online classes through about the fall break, on-campus classes through the fall break and then online. Whereas there's a smaller group, including my institution, that have already decided that we're going to offer classes online. I think this year will be a good experiment for most colleges and universities, but I am a little concerned that the majority, 60%, I mean, we're talking 300 institutions, that they are still planning to work under their existing model and make some adjustments with the social distancing rules and regulations. I'm not a medical doctor, but I do have some concern of the impact that that's going to have, or could have rather, on campus communities here across the U.S. And I think a lot of that is being driven by their reliance on revenue as well. And so I wonder, do we place one's health and safety underneath the priority of the business?
So a lot of your experience has been with enrollment and enrollment management, and you are currently working as a vice president of Elite School, and your core department is again enrollment management. So what would you advise institutions like Blackstone or other institutions? How can they keep a steady flow of students, and how can, or maybe I would like to start, what have been your go-to techniques or go-to processes that have always helped bringing in a healthy enrollment for your institution?
Yeah, I thank you for the question. And I think it really starts with, if you are truly a student-centric institution, and by all means, everything that I've read and know about yourself and Dean Akram, you're very student-centered and you have a very innovative model. And so it really goes back to the first component is, how can we meet our students where they are? And by that, I mean, how do we not place unnecessary barriers to their ability to access and succeed in their education? How are we held responsible to adjust, or rather adapt, and pivot to support their work? With that said, some go-tos can be where, once you've got established an institution or a program, who is your ideal student, and then kind of breaking that kind of aspirational notion down to the realities of who are our students. What are they telling us that they need to be successful, and are we able to offer those resources? And if not, why? And two, in terms of affordability, in terms of access, I think we're building our business models to run our institutions. We often, or I should say, just say the institutions I've worked at, they get very excited about the profit that they're able to bring in, and I fear that sometimes that's too reliant on placing unrealistic expectations on students in terms of their ability to perhaps complete their degree in a certain amount of time, take a certain amount of credits. So I think that needs to be adjusted. And then thirdly, there are many, but just in summary, thirdly, it's just to ensure that your message of being student-centered is embedded in your DNA, so that the types of scholarships that you offer, how does that reflect diversity and inclusion, the faculty that you hire, the curriculum that you design? Can the students actually see and feel themselves in that work? And I said that was going to be three, but I think one tiny caveat would be, which I see that Blackstone does very well, is being able to provide students an opportunity to engage with their communities immediately and to value the experience that they bring to the table, seeing that really as a to grow from.
So one opportunity that we as an institution has come across because of this pandemic is, since all the classes went online, so we were at a lot of, not a lot, but some of international students to our classroom. So that added some diversity and some viewpoints from around the world. So we have students right now from around 5 or 6 countries that are studying with students here in Pakistan, and that kind of raises the quality. But if I talk about the US institution or your institution or other institution, that higher education institution, what do you see? Would these institutions be taking international students on this fall, or would that happen in the next semester in January? What are your insights on that?
You know, that is a recent challenge that the U.S. institutions are facing. Our current presidential administration has made amendment to our kind of normal international student admissions and continuous enrollment process. They are indicating that if international students would be in a 100% learning experience, that they would not be eligible to stay in the U.S. under their F1 visa. And so there has to be at least 50% of their, kind of a hybrid model, at least 50% of their education has to have an in-person component versus online. And that is impacting many institutions, U.S. institutions at the undergraduate and graduate level, one in terms of international student enrollment, and two, in terms of revenue. There are other institutions like ourselves or our larger institutions that have always had online learning that would certainly allow students to reside in their home countries and engage in an online experience, but it does limit that ability to have the experience of learning in a new country or culture. And so that is hitting the higher ed community pretty hard right now. Not to talk politics, but it just adds to some of the challenges that we have with diversity inclusion in the U.S.
So I can, when you talk about diversity and inclusion in the US and the segment that you're trying to incorporate in higher education and what you have worked for in the last 18 years, that kind of resembles a very big segment of population here in Pakistan, because Pakistan or Pakistani education, higher education, has always lacked, not only on an academic level but on an administrative level as well. So the institution here, or the Ministry of Education here, has not been able to incorporate students from diverse backgrounds. And the government does not have that kind of money to provide education to a lot of people, so that creates a challenge as well. So if you were to advise the ministry here, what would be your some of the main points that you can highlight where they can provide easy access to higher education, and without costing them a huge revenue, or a lot of fee in terms of charging it either to the students, or putting a financial burden on the government?
Yes, some programs that I've seen work, and they're not as prevalent as I think that they could be. But rethinking this notion of work study. So could a student perhaps work for that specific institution to support, in order to have access to free tuition, if you will? Or could the student perhaps delay payment on their tuition until they actually graduate and start to earn an income? Could they actually, pay after the fact, a delayed kind of payment plan? And then third would be for those students that can or do have the ability, financial ability to afford higher education. Is there a way for them to pay it forward? So could they not only pay their own tuition, but could they maybe at a discount, but that discount is then given back in the form of their ability to support a future student upon their graduation and entering the workforce. A larger notion that might be a little bit of a fantasy of mine in terms of global higher education would be, I haven't seen it, and I'm hoping one day that there could be a global perspective in terms of access, equity, and diversity and inclusion in higher ed. The closest organization that exists right now is really the United Nations, and I know they have been more focused on security and human rights and sustainable development. But I feel that because when we think about the world's population being 7.5 billion, yet only 7% on average of the adults have college degrees, I see this as a global, also a global crisis, a global pandemic in terms of access to higher education. And I think that we do need the leaders of our countries to really use this moment, one, to use technology to connect, and two, to talk about how, beyond, I should say beyond, but in addition to our health and safety, of course, how we can use this moment to ensure that more people have access to education. And could it be a global fund where countries would also contribute funding? It doesn't have to be equally, but could there be some funding that could support more diverse students that historically have not been able to access higher ed?
So what you have just shared with us, it kind of it's very intriguing that there is no global effort in terms of providing education, and only 7% of the world population gets a chance to be to study at a college level. And then we can see why then there are a lot of problems that trickle down in terms of economic problems, social problems, and in terms of law and order situation, or health situation that we are facing right now, where people are not able to follow rules. So coming back to this, so are there any efforts happening within the UN, or any efforts that you have seen within countries where they are working together towards higher education, where they are sharing knowledge or expertise and resources with each other?
I'm seeing it more at an individual institutional level, and most of the initiatives are being driven either by the institutions or usually what I would call courageous faculty that are trying to build partnerships across different higher education institutions across country lines. I have not seen any public policy per se, and certainly, again, not to talk politics, but I don't think our current leader here in the U.S. prioritizes access to higher education. Hopefully that can change. And I'm on that note too, I would also say that what is encouraging through those kind of individual institutions or faculty partnerships is that there are models out there. They just need more highlighting. They need more resources. I think of some of the U.S. Colleges and universities that have quote unquote international locations. That's a foundational level. That's a presence. I think I see that more as a revenue approach as opposed to more of a diplomacy way to build. But I think there is some infrastructure, and I think there is motivation from the academic side. It's just a matter of, I think, at the political level. For someone to lead that charge. I probably do need to do more research to see if there have been any recent developments, of course. But I think as a global community, as we think about that really access to education, we're in a crisis there, and we need to pay greater attention.
So, if it is not happening globally, if we talk about nationally, it's a very easy sell to understand if you educate your population and that can not only bring more economic activity, it can enhance the GDP, and it will have there is great return on investment on that. So it's an easy thought. It's common knowledge. But when it comes to public policy, why do you think that there is a failure in almost every country? Like a very small portion of the budget or the resources are allocated to education. I know in the US, the institutions work on their own, but the state-funded institution, they are also always struggling in terms of getting more resources from their state or from the federal government.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I have 2 points to respond. One is, if we look at the national budget in the U.S., I think it's something near $7.65 billion has been proposed for our national defense budget. If we look at education, it's a fraction of that. And so it really goes back to values. And I really think that throughout history, and especially now, we are in the midst of not only a crisis, but a war of ideas and values. And usually those in power and leadership are going to place their financial resources to where their values are, and that may not be reflective of their citizenry, of their community. And that is a problem. Two, as you mentioned, many states, institutions are seeing their state governors slashing funding to education to redirect that funding to public health efforts. And certainly we cannot enjoy the benefit of learning unless we are able to live and breathe first and foremost. But that does place access to education in a very vulnerable position that is reliant upon what is going on, certainly economically, politically, environmentally, etc. And so with that said, I think the point is, does our world value education? And as you mentioned, a good majority of our global citizens don't have access to it. And it really goes back to, this is just my perspective in my research and learning in terms of education. There is a position of power that many global leaders want to maintain. And when you grant more access to education, the more likely your citizenry or your community may start to question or peel back the layers of the onion, which is why I'm so appreciative of Blackstone and your students, and in that you are looking into real world relevant legal research and work, because we need more of it. We need more challenges and questions of why are things the way they are? Why do certain countries, states, or even the world, why do we value this notion of money over one's ability for health and well-being. So a lot of work still needs to be done. With that said, I think we have to just be more aware and more transparent of how connected everything really is. That one global pandemic is having an immediate impact on a world society, and that this gives us an opportunity to reevaluate our values, not only on public health, but education for the future. And so I wish I had more concrete, clear examples, but it really is a area that needs more study, needs more advocacy, needs more prioritization.
Thank you for the response. And I was also wondering that since you mentioned the future of education and then where we are heading. So in your view, what do you see? Would it be private institutions that would be stepping up? Would it be businesses training their workforce for their future work? Or would it be technology companies? Or would it be public? Or or do you see a partnership of some of these different public and private institutions?
Yes, absolutely. I think if history tells us anything, most innovation, most risk-taking, most leading us forward, revolutionary thought has come from private industry. So certainly if there, I think about Bill Gates, who shows up on many documentaries as of late, in terms of having some perspective on what's going on in the world right now. And I think he doesn't necessarily have a background to be a diplomat per se, but clearly his work as a businessman, as a technology leader for a product that has infiltrated the world, speaks volumes. And so I think that, we need to break down the silos or the barriers in terms of even just thinking about industry versus government versus nonprofit versus for-profit. We are a human family, and I think that we need to start having those courageous conversations. But I do think, as you mentioned, perhaps industry is where it needs to start, and industry can influence government for sure in terms of where its values are placed in terms of resources.
So what would you advise students who are facing this uncertainty at the moment and in the recent future, especially students who are graduating this year or who are about to graduate next year? What would be your advice to them?
Yeah, first and foremost, I just want to acknowledge what a tremendously difficult time this is for everyone. And the thought of having to just live and breathe on a daily basis and also stay very intellectually focused on graduating or thinking about the next step and looking for a career is a tremendous challenge. And so I just want to extend my grace and my positive prayers to you all on that note. But I would also say, don't lose hope. This is an opportunity actually for you to help recreate, reimagine, or innovate your particular field. And it also gives us an opportunity to really acknowledge, I think I said earlier, just really acknowledge how closely we are connected. This is a world community. And so perhaps you may have had a thought of what your career trajectory or path was when you first entered Blackstone or when you're thinking about entering it. I would encourage you to revisit that vision and that work and really assess, where some of the true challenges are from a world perspective and where you might actually be able to contribute or create a new framework or law or policy to support your local community, but also the global community. I see you all as world leaders, if you choose, the future world leaders, if you choose to be. If you do have, access to technology, which is certainly a privilege, use that technology to build communities or build connection with communities or individuals that you never thought about. You don't have to hop on a plane anymore. It's just a matter of getting someone's time in building that conversation, whatever it may be, whether it's the leader of your country, whether it's a top CEO, go after them. Get them engaged in conversation. Find out what they're thinking about the future and how you might be able to contribute to that work.
Thank you, thank you. That's amazing advice, because I think it's very important for students to not think that they're restricted. In some ways, they are more open and they can reach out to a lot more people. A lot of students, current students at Blackstone, they ask about opportunities in terms of internship opportunities with law firms in the UK, because they want to become barristers. And I had the pleasure of hosting a few of the barristers, and they were saying that it's a plain level field now. You can there are a lot of opportunities that are presented that they can acquire online. And once they do that, if they have the skill, they can go out and reach out to people and provide their skill. So thank you very much for your time. It's very refreshing to see that you're so passionate about higher education, and you're so passionate about diversity and inclusion, and also you do see a future, and you clearly see the problems that are right now, and that also gives us a bit of perspective of where we are and how we can contribute in terms of higher education here in Pakistan.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor and a privilege.
Thank you. All right, bye.